The wilderness of Siberia is a place where the line between the living and the dead often blurs. In August of 1993, a group of Ukrainian kayakers was navigating the treacherous rapids of the Snezhnaya River. The water was high and the forest was thick, but as they rounded a bend, they saw something that froze them in place. On the rocky bank stood a girl. She was motionless as if she had been standing there for centuries. As the boats drifted closer, the kayakers realized, this was no hiker taking a break. The girl was covered from head to toe in dark, dried blood. It was caked in her hair, and it had turned her clothing into a stiff, rust-colored shroud. She didn't wave for help. She didn't shout. She simply stared at them with hollow eyes. When the kayakers finally reached the shore and touched her shoulder, she didn't speak. She let out a sound of pure primal grief. This was Valentina Utochenko. She was the lone survivor of a tragedy so horrific that it is whispered about in the same breath as the Dyatlov Pass. But while Dyatlov remains a mystery of shadows, Valentina saw exactly what happened to her friends. She saw them die in a way that defies every law of nature. The Iron Leader. To understand the horror, we have to look at the woman who led them there. Lyudmila Korovina was not just a hiker, she was a master of survival. In the post-Soviet era, she was a legend known for her iron discipline and her refusal to be intimidated by the elements. She believed the mountains were a cathedral for the strong and a graveyard for the weak. For this expedition, she had handpicked her 6 best students from a hiking club in Petropavlovsk. They were the elite: Alexander, Tatiana, Denise, Victoria, Timur, and Valentina. They were young and healthy, and they looked up to Lyudmila as a mother figure. They set out for the Khamar-Daban range with high spirits. They were filming their journey and keeping detailed journals. They were prepared for cold. They were prepared for hunger, but they were not prepared for the mountain to turn against them. Lyudmila had led dozens of groups through these peaks, but this time the mountain felt different. The air was heavy and the silence was suffocating. By the first few days of August, the group had made excellent progress. But on the afternoon of August 4th, the Siberian weather showed its true face. A massive storm of freezing rain and sleet descended on the peaks. Visibility vanished, and the temperature plummeted toward zero. The group reached an exposed ridge on the slopes of Gora Golets. Normally, a veteran like Lyudmila would have ordered the team to descend into the tree line where the forest could provide a windbreak and fuel for a fire. Instead, she made a decision that investigators still struggle to explain. She ordered the group to make camp right there on the barren rock. There were no trees. There was no shelter. They were completely exposed to the elements. They spent a night of misery, huddled in their thin nylon tents, listening to the wind howl like a dying animal. They were soaked and shivering, but they were still a team. They believed that when the sun rose, they would simply walk down into the valley and find warmth. They had no idea that for 6 of them, that sunrise would be their last. On the morning of August 5th, the storm had faded into a thick white fog. The group was packing their wet gear and preparing to leave the ridge. Alexander, who was the strongest of the boys, suddenly stopped. He didn't slip and he wasn't hit by a falling rock. He clutched his ears and let out a scream that shattered the morning silence. It was a sound of absolute physical agony. As the others watched in terror, blood began to pour from Alexander's eyes and ears. He fell into the mud, clutching his stomach and gasping for air, as if his lungs had turned to glass. Foam mixed with blood bubbled from his mouth as his body racked with violent tremors. Lyudmila rushed to his side, shouting for the others to grab the medical kit, but she never made it. As she knelt over Alexander, she looked at her own hands. Her eyes went wide. She began to sway, her vision blurring as a strange vibration began to ripple through the very ground they stood on. The air was turning into a weapon, and the slaughter on the ridge had only just begun. The death of Alexander was the spark that lit the fuse of a nightmare. Lyudmila Korovina, the veteran instructor who had survived decades of Siberian winters, didn't hesitate. She threw herself into the mud beside her favorite student, ignoring the blood that was soaking into her own clothes. She was shouting for the rest of the group to stay back to grab the first aid kits, to find a way to stabilize him, but as she looked into Alexander's eyes, she saw something that broke even her legendary composure. His eyes weren't just bleeding. They were collapsing. Before she could speak another word, Lyudmila herself began to sway. Her breathing turned into a wet, rattling sound, as if her lungs were filling with fluid. She clutched her head, her fingers digging into her scalp with such force that she tore her own skin. She looked at Valentina one last time, her mouth opening to give a final command, but only a thick, dark spray of blood came out. The woman who had been the anchor for the entire group slumped over the body of Alexander and went still. In less than 2 minutes, the leader was dead. The matriarch was gone, and the mountain was just getting started. What followed was not a logical attempt at survival, but a total collapse of human reason. The group didn't run for help. They didn't try to perform CPR. They simply began to fall apart as if a switch had been flipped in their brains. Dennis was the next to go. He was the strongest remaining boy, but he didn't scream. He simply turned and began to run blindly into the thick white fog. He wasn't running toward the trees. He was running from something inside his own head. Valentina watched in horror as he disappeared into the mist, only for the sound of sickening thuds to echo back to the ridge. Dennis was found later having beaten his own head against the jagged rocks until he was unrecognizable. Then the madness took the girls. Victoria and Tatiana, they had been the closest friends in the group, but now they looked at each other with eyes full of a primal, terrifying vacantness. They began to tear at their own throats, clawing at their skin as if they were being strangled by invisible wires. They were biting their own tongues and hitting their heads against the frozen ground. They didn't try to save each other. They crawled toward a nearby rock, clenching their stomachs in a final desperate embrace before their bodies began to rack with violent seizures. Blood was everywhere. It was on the moss, it was in the mud, and it was being washed away by the freezing rain that had started to fall again. Timur, the last of the boys, tried to reach for his backpack. He was shaking so hard he couldn't even grip the straps. He looked at Valentina, his face a mask of pure confusion and pain. He tried to speak, but his voice was gone. He fell face first into the mud, his body twitching for a few seconds before he too became part of the silence on the ridge. Valentina was the only one left standing. She was surrounded by the bodies of her friends and her mentor, all of whom had died in the same agonizing way. There was no sound on the ridge now, except for the rhythmic drip of rain and the low hum of the mountain. Valentina felt a strange vibration in her own chest. Her vision began to blur, and her teeth started to ache with a dull, throbbing pain. She realized that the air itself had become an enemy. The mountain was screaming in a frequency that the human ear couldn't hear, but the human body could feel. It was as if her internal organs were being shaken apart by a giant, invisible hand. She knew that if she stayed for even one more minute, she would be joining the others in the mud. Valentina didn't think about the journals. She didn't think about the cameras or the maps. She grabbed her pack and bolted. She ran down the slope, sliding through the slush and the blood of her friends. She didn't look back at the bodies of Lyudmila or Alexander. She ran until her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, and her heart was hammering against her ribs. She dove into the tree line and kept moving, descending as fast as she could away from the ridge of Gorogolets. She didn't stop until the fog had cleared and the air felt light again. She was alone in one of the most remote wildernesses on the planet, with nothing but a wet backpack and the memory of her friend's eyes melting in the fog. She was the only witness to a slaughter that had no killer and a massacre that used no weapons. The mountain of the dead had taken its tithe, and Valentina was the only soul allowed to leave the altar alive. For 4 days, Valentina Utochenko was no longer a person. She was a ghost wandering through a green and gray cathedral of pine and stone. When she fled the ridge of Gorogolets, she didn't have a plan. She didn't have a map. She only had the primal instinct to put as much distance as possible between herself and the bodies of her friends. She moved like a machine, her mind having retreated into a dark corner of her psyche to protect itself from the memory of Lyudmila's eyes. The first night was the hardest. She had no tent and no fire. She huddled under a thicket of pine branches, listening to every snap of a twig and every rustle of the wind. In the deep wilderness of Siberia, the silence isn't empty. It is heavy. She could still feel the phantom vibration in her teeth, the low hum of the mountain that had liquidated her team. She spent the hours of darkness convinced that the invisible force was creeping down the slopes behind her, reaching out with silent hands to stop her heart. But the sun rose, and she was still breathing. She was alive, but she was alone on a territory that swallowed even the strongest men. On the second day, Valentina found a sign of human life. Through the thick morning mist, she saw the skeletal frame of a relay tower standing on a distant hill. It was a relic of the Soviet era, a rusted needle of steel pointing toward the sky. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. She climbed toward it, her hands bleeding as she clawed through the brush, thinking there would be a radio or a bunk, or at least a person to tell her she was safe. But when she reached the base, she found only a hollow shell. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the interior was stripped of everything but dust and shadows. There were no wires, there was no power. It was just another grave in the mountains. She stayed there for a few hours, sheltered from the rain, but the isolation was worse than the storm. She realized then that no one was coming for her. If she wanted to live, she had to find the water. She followed the logic of every lost soul in the taiga. She found a stream and she followed it down until it met the Snezhnaya river. By the 4th day, Valentina was a shell of a human being. Her clothing was shredded and her skin was a map of scratches and bruises. She had stopped eating. She had stopped feeling the cold. She was standing on the rocky bank of the Snezhnaya River, staring at the fast-moving water when she saw them. 4 kayaks, bright flashes of blue and yellow cutting through the gray mist. The Ukrainian kayakers who saw her thought at first they were seeing a hallucination. A girl standing perfectly still, covered in dark, dried blood that looked like a second skin. She didn't wave. She didn't shout. It was only when they pulled their boats onto the rocks and walked toward her that she collapsed. She fell into their arms like a pile of broken sticks, her mouth opening to let out a sound that the kayakers later described as a howl from another world. They wrapped her in blankets and fed her warm broth. But Valentina didn't look at them. She only looked back toward the peaks of Khamar-Daban, her lips moving in a silent prayer for the friends she had left in the mud. When Valentina was finally stable enough to talk, the Russian authorities were skeptical. They thought the group had been poisoned by bad food or perhaps succumbed to a freak weather event. But when the search and rescue teams finally reached the ridge of Gorogolets, they found a scene that defied every theory. The bodies of the 6 hikers were exactly where Valentina said they would be. They hadn't been touched by predators, they hadn't been moved. The autopsies conducted in the city of Ulan-Ude were even more disturbing. The hikers had not died of hypothermia. They had not been poisoned. The medical reports stated that every single one of them had died of massive internal hemorrhaging. Their lungs had collapsed. Their hearts had suffered rapid failure. Their internal organs looked as if they had been exposed to a high-pressure vacuum or a massive dose of radiation. Yet there was no radiation on the mountain. There were no chemicals in their blood. Officially, the cause of death was listed as accidental. But to those who read the full reports, the message was clear. Their bodies had been shaken apart from the inside out. Something on that mountain had reached into their biology and turned it off. And as the case was quietly closed, the question remained. Was it nature or was it something much more deliberate? When the official investigation into the Khamar-Daban incident was closed, the Russian government provided a convenient label. They called it a tragedy caused by the elements and poor decision-making. But labels don't explain why 6 healthy young people began to bleed from their eyes in the span of 5 minutes. They don't explain why a veteran instructor would choose a barren ridge over the safety of the trees. Over the years, researchers and conspiracy theorists have picked apart the bones of this case, looking for the truth that was left on the ridge. The theories range from the scientific to the conspiratorial, but they all share one common thread. Something happened on that mountain that was beyond human control. Something was triggered on the morning of August 5th that turned the ridge into a biological kill zone. And while Valentina has moved on and refused to return to the range, the theories suggest that the killer is still there waiting for the next group to walk into its trap. The most widely accepted scientific theory is as fascinating as it is terrifying. It is called infrasound. When wind hits the jagged peaks and narrow valleys of a mountain range like Khamar-Daban, it could create a low-frequency sound wave that is below the range of human hearing. You cannot hear it, but your body can feel it. These waves are powerful enough to vibrate the internal organs of a human being. Scientists have found that certain frequencies of infrasound can cause the human heart to resonate until it fails, or cause the lungs to vibrate until the capillaries burst. But it does more than just physical damage. Infrasound is known to cause intense feelings of dread, hallucinations, and a total loss of rational thought. It creates a biological madness where the victim feels an overwhelming need to escape their own skin. This would explain why Dennis ran into the fog, and why the others began to tear at their own throats. They weren't just dying, their brains were being scrambled by a sound that was coming from the very earth beneath their feet. The ridge of Gora Golets wasn't just a place. It was a giant acoustic pipe, playing a frequency of death. But for those who don't trust the official reports, there is a darker possibility. The Khamar-Daban incident happened in 1993, a time when Russia was in total upheaval, and the secrets of the Soviet military were being sold or abandoned. Some believe the hiking group accidentally stumbled into a secret testing ground. There are whispers of a lost Soviet weapon, a precursor to the nerve agents that have made headlines in recent years. A cloud of chemical gas released from a nearby hidden facility or a forgotten storage site could have been pushed up the mountain by the storm. A nerve agent like Novichok would cause exactly the symptoms Valentina described: the foaming at the mouth, the seizures, the bleeding from the eyes, and the rapid internal collapse. If the mountain air had become a concentrated chemical cloud, Lyudmila and her students never stood a chance. The military would have known exactly what happened, but acknowledging it would have meant admitting to a war crime on their own soil. It was easier to let the world believe it was a freak accident of nature. Valentina Utochenko eventually rebuilt her life. She married, she had children, and she walked away from the world of professional hiking. For years, she remained the only person who knew what the last minutes of Lyudmila Korovina's life really looked like. She has spoken to the press only a handful of times, and each time her story remains the same. She doesn't blame the government, and she doesn't talk about secret weapons. She only talks about the mountain. The mystery of Khamar-Daban remains one of the darkest files in the archives of Russian history. It reminds us that even with all our modern technology and our maps, there are places on this planet that do not belong to us. There are frequencies we cannot hear and secrets we were never meant to uncover. Today, the ridge of Gora Golets is quiet. The yellow tents are long gone, and the blood has been washed away by 30 years of Siberian snow. But if you ever find yourself in those mountains and the wind begins to shift into a low vibrating hum, remember the team of 7. Remember Valentina. And above all else, remember to run. Because some secrets don't just stay buried. They wait.